Welcome back to our second lecture this week. I want to take just a brief time to dive in a little bit deeper to this idea of generational difference. Now, the book by Jean Twenge that you're going to be reading really begins to delve a little bit deeper in this idea of generationalism. And she spends a lot of time talking about this. And again, we know that the benefits of generationalism and generational thinking is that we're able to um, reflect on the fact that young people grew up at a particular time in life that has an impact on the way that they think about their lives and their relationships and all that comes with that. We also know there's a limitation to generationalism in that not everybody fits those categories very, very well, and we have to be very, very careful to not oversimplify. What I love about what Twenge does is that I think she begins to find ways to talk about generationalism that's a little bit more particular and a little more nuanced, and I think that's really, really helpful. And I want to just take a minute to unpack that a little bit with you, because I think it's going to really help you as you think about generations. So when we think about this, we know that Twenge talks about this in her book, and you'll see that in there, and she unpacks this a little bit more. But she says that there's a lot of things that have an effect on generational differences. We know there are generational differences. If you only have to be in a work setting or a church setting or a particular setting, and you know that you see and feel the generational differences. But it's not just because people are different or because somebody's older or younger. It actually is something that grows much deeper than that. And so she talks about these different factors that are brought to bear on generational differences. One is this sense of more of a communal versus individual way to think about the ways that we live. In especially Western culture, we find that there is a very high degree of individualism. We are celebrated for when we become independent. We are told to go and make it on our own. And while culturally this can be different in different contexts, there is still this encouragement to think about what's best for you and how that begins to be impacted. Now, right, culturally, there's going to be some cultures that hold much more to more of a collective view of that. So this particular dynamic might be greater or smaller depending on your background and your familial connections. So what Twenge is saying is, depending on the degree of individualism, it all has an effect on the generational differences that one might feel. Also, she talks about the difference between a slower life and a faster life. Now, when it comes to a faster life, that's when oftentimes birth rates, birth deaths are higher, or birth rates are lower, and you recognize the fact that perhaps for more of, say, an agrarian culture, a young person has to grow up more quickly so that they can contribute to the success of the family. Whether that's the farm or the business or whatever it might be, children are a part of family survival. And so there's an impulse for a faster life, meaning that one needs to grow up more quickly. And oftentimes what this means is that families will have more children, because if the mortality rate is higher for children in a particular period of life, you're going to want to have more children for fear that some may not actually make it to adulthood. Now, where we live in most Western culture right now is, we could probably say, and this is what Twenge talks about, is that there's actually a slower life. That the mortality rate for children is very, very low. That the chances of survival for a child are much higher, and therefore, because of that, along with the fact that families are often contained and are sufficient in other sort of ways because they live more in urban centers, or there isn't the need for to necessarily take care of the family farm or that type of thing, that children have the opportunity for a slower life. They grow up more slowly. And because the mortality rate is low, parents have fewer children as well, because the chances of them dying are much less. So more attention is given to a child, more time is given to the child for them to grow up and become contributing members of society. So that has an effect on the way generations think as well, because another generation maybe won't have this luxury as much. And again, these categories here can be bigger or smaller depending on background and all that comes with that. Twenge also talks about this idea of major events. Of course, that's going to have a generational impact. And oftentimes what we see in a lot of generationalism when we're talking about boomers or millennials or Gen Z or whatever, a lot of times it's focused more on just major events, like something crazy has happened in the world, something significant has happened during their lifetime that has an impact on them, and that oftentimes distinguishes one generation from the next. What I like about what Twenge is saying is she's saying that's just one piece of a larger matrix of things that are happening there. Now, she also brings up this really important dynamic of technology. She suggests that the way technology interacts with all these other elements have a dramatic effect on generational differences. The technology in its broadest sense has shaped the way the world works. Everything from the light bulb to the train, to transportation, to communications, to all these different factors have had a dramatic effect on the way people experience the world, the way they experience others, and the ways that oftentimes they grow up. Now, when we think about technology today, we see it in the information realm just going like gangbusters, right? The things that young people experience today, a previous generation would have never dreamed of. So we have those factors as well that bring, in many ways, this impact on generational differences. Generational differences oftentimes are just about the ways that one generation can relate to the other generation. And when there are differences, it makes it harder for them to do that. So these are some of the ways that Twenge begins to unpack and think about this idea of generational differences. And I find it quite helpful when we begin to talk about this, rather than just labeling older people one way and younger people another, or saying it's all technology's fault, or or something like that. We begin to see that there are a lot of factors at play that we need to more thoughtfully consider as we communicate with others and as we think about that ourselves. Now, what's interesting is that sociologically and philosophically, there's something else that's going on here that we try to unpack, and you'll read about in a little bit in some of our other readings, and that is that I think what we have happening, and Harmat Rosa talks about this, of this idea of acceleration and alienation. He suggests that the world in current times is speeding up and moving faster and faster, and this speeding up creates the problem of relational alienation. We are having to move faster and faster to make it in our world. We have less time for each other. And generationally, we find that there is less commonality between one generation to the next. And so there's less common ground when it comes to lived experience with the way that we relate to each other. So what's even more profound about that is that a lot of times as you look at generational theory, we sort of think that it's this 20-year or 2-decade period. But perhaps what acceleration is doing is it's actually saying that within that 20-year period, there's not one generation, but there's actually 4 or 5 generations. And you probably feel this. When you think about, say, your high school cohort and the way that they relate to each other, or where they spend their time on social media, or how they engage the world compared to, say, the middle schoolers that you know, and where they spend their time, and what they are interacting with when it comes to social media and all that comes with that. Sometimes you almost have 2 different worlds. That's acceleration. That's where we see within proposed or a generation, multiple generations where there are different experiences. Now, because of this acceleration and the different experiences that we have, as I mentioned before, sometimes it's just harder for one generation to relate to the next. Because their experiences are so different. And when there's less overlap of shared experience, it makes it harder to connect with one another. Now, we know from research, and you'll read about this in some of the texts that I have for you, that intergenerational connection is really, really important. Like it actually makes a difference in faith formation and support and all that comes with that. And so I'm all about intergenerational ministry and how we think about that. And at the same time, this idea of intragenerational speed, this idea of alienation makes us realize that intergenerational relationships actually require a lot of work. The shared experiences, the starting point where we can have a conversation, are less and less. And so young people don't know how to relate to old people, and old people are intimidated of young people. And as much as we love intergenerational ministry, we realize that a lot of us aren't doing it simply because oftentimes of the speed of which the world is moving, and because of the dynamics that we just talked about the generational differences that Twenge brought up. Now, I'm not saying this to be depressing, nor am I saying that we throw up our hands. I think this is the point, though, where oftentimes when you talk with people in your ministry, if they're like, man, I don't know how to relate to young people, I don't understand them today, to kind of go, yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Do you know why that is? It's not because they're bad or you're bad. It's actually because there's less to relate to. And so we have to lean in a little bit harder and work a little bit harder to foster and work on those relationships. Super important when you work with youth leader volunteers. Volunteers, I think, sometimes think that they're going to walk in and just relate to young people like because they were a young person once, and then they just freeze, because it just seems like a foreign land to them. This is the moment where you have to kind of say it's hard, because it is, and this is where we have to pay more attention. We'll talk more about that in the future. So when we think about this idea of generational differences, let me just leave you with some self-questions for this one. Where have you found it harder to connect with young people, even if you're a youth leader? I think asking those questions can be really, really helpful. Also, what questions or statements of connection do you hear from adults and parents about young people? I find this a lot with parents who they're like, I don't know how to relate to my kid anymore. They don't listen to me. I don't know what they're doing. Like, we can look at that and be like, no, don't think that way. Or we can kind of say, oh, that's an intergenerational speed moment. That's a connection topic. We could talk about that. See how that works? And then also, where have you seen generations connect? What happened and why do you think it worked? As much as we talk about the challenge that comes with generational difference, I also know that oftentimes faith communities are great places where that connection really does happen. Doesn't mean that it always works the same way. Doesn't mean like there's like a magical formula. But I think it's good for us to celebrate when those connections happen, and then to reflect on, well, what happened there? Why were people talking? What made it feel like the generations actually took a step toward each other? I think when we begin to think about this, we begin to understand the challenge that we have with generational difference, and at the same time, the opportunity that lies before us as well. Hope that helps.